Wait, let me get this straight. You are offering me her as a payment? Jonas leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed as he pointed a calloused finger at the alien girl standing meekly in front of him. The merchant, a slippery-looking Zarlin with too many arms and an unsettling grin, clasped his primary hands together and leaned forward, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. Ah, yes, Captain Jonas. She's no ordinary slave, you see. Well-trained, obedient, and speaks over 30 intergalactic languages. Quite the bargain if you ask me. Jonas glanced back at the girl. She was slight, barely reaching his shoulder, with iridescent skin that shimmered faintly under the flickering lights of the cantina. Her large, almond-shaped eyes glowed a soft violet, but there was no defiance in them, only resignation. Don't you have credits? Jonas asked, irritation creeping into his tone. Or fuel cells? I'm not running a charity here. The Zarlin chuckled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Credits are scarce these days, Captain. But a girl like her? She's worth 10 times the amount I owe you. Maybe more. Think of it as an investment. Jonas sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. He wasn't in the business of owning slaves, let alone alien ones. But the Zarlin's debt was significant, and the thought of leaving empty-handed didn't sit right with him either. What's her name? Jonas asked, his voice softening despite himself. The girl lifted her gaze for the first time, her violet eyes locking onto his. Her voice, when she spoke, was melodic but subdued. My name is Era. Jonas tilted his head, studying her. There was something odd about her, something that didn't quite fit the picture of a downtrodden servant. Still, he shrugged it off. All right, Era. Guess you're coming with me. The Zarlin clapped his hands together. Excellent. A pleasure doing business with you, Captain. I'll be off now. Plenty of other deals to make. Jonas barely acknowledged him as the merchant slithered away, his focus still on the girl. You any good at repairing starships? Era hesitated, her slender fingers twisting nervously. I can learn. Figures, Jonas muttered. Well, come on then. The Raven's Edge isn't going to run itself. As they stepped out into the bustling spaceport, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a deal he didn't fully understand. As they weaved through the chaotic maze of the spaceport, Jonas caught himself glancing back at Era every so often. She followed quietly, her steps light and deliberate, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. He found it odd. Most slaves he'd encountered either trudged along in defeat or wore their misery like a badge. But Era moved with an eerie grace, her head held just high enough to suggest she wasn't entirely beaten down. The Raven's Edge came into view, its battered hull gleaming faintly under the harsh lights of the docking bay. Jonas had flown the ship for years, patching it up after every scrape and firefight. To him, it was more than just a vessel. It was home. Welcome to the edge of the galaxy, Jonas said dryly, gesturing at the ship. Era's eyes widened slightly as she took in the vessel. It's bigger than I expected, she said, her voice soft. Jonas smirked. She's ugly, but she'll get you where you need to go. Come on. Inside, the ship's interior was a mishmash of functionality and clutter. Tools were strewn across a workbench, half-empty mugs of coffee sat precariously on consoles, and the faint hum of the engine reverberated through the walls. Jonas turned to her. You'll bunk here, he said, pointing to a small cabin near the engine room. It's not much, but it's better than the floor. Era stepped inside, her violet eyes scanning the space. The room was bare except for a cot, a storage locker, and a tiny window that offered a sliver of a view of the stars. She ran her fingers along the edge of the cot, her expression unreadable. You'll work for your keep, Jonas continued. Repairs, cleaning, whatever needs doing. Think you can handle that? She nodded. Yes, Captain. Jonas, he corrected. None of that captain nonsense. We're not running a military ship here. Era hesitated, then gave a small nod. Yes, Jonas. He watched her for a moment longer, something about her still gnawing at the back of his mind. But he pushed the thought aside. She was just another unexpected wrinkle in his already chaotic life. Jonas left her to settle in and headed to the cockpit. His co-pilot, Tarek, a gruff, scaled alien with a penchant for sarcasm, was lounging in the pilot's chair. "You're back," Tarek said without looking up from his datapad. "And you brought, what? A souvenir?" Jonas flopped into the seat beside him with a groan. The Zarlan couldn't pay his debt, so he pawned off the girl. Tarek snorted, his frilled neck ruffling in amusement. "You're kidding. What are you going to do with her? Start a babysitting service?" "She's not a kid," Jonas said, rubbing his temples. "And I didn't exactly have a choice. Either I take her, or I walk away empty-handed." "Right," Tarek drawled. "And you couldn't resist playing the hero." Jonas shot him a look. "Don't start." The ship lurched slightly as Tarek powered up the engines. "Well, it's your problem now," he said. "But I'll tell you this, there's something off about her." Jonas didn't reply, but Tarek's words stuck with him. There was something off about Era, and he had a feeling he'd find out what sooner than he wanted. Later that night, as the Raven's Edge drifted through the quiet void of space, Jonas found himself restless. He wandered down to the engine room, where Era was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a datapad in her hands. "You're up late," he said, leaning against the doorway. Era looked up, startled. "I'm studying the ship schematics," she said. "I thought it might help." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "You're studying?" She nodded, holding up the datapad. "I said I'd learn." He crossed his arms, watching her closely. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Era looked away, her expression guarded. "I just want to be useful." Jonas hesitated. There was a vulnerability in her voice that tugged at something deep within him. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the ship jolted violently, alarms blaring throughout the cabin. "What the hell?" Jonas barked, rushing toward the cockpit with Era close on his heels. Tarek was already at the controls, his scaled hands flying across the console. "We've got company," he growled. Outside, a sleek, ominous ship was bearing down on them, its weapons locked and ready. "Who are they?" Jonas demanded. Tarek's frills flattened in a sign of tension. "Pirates. And not the friendly kind." Era froze, her violet eyes wide with fear. "They're here for me," she whispered. Jonas turned to her sharply. "What are you talking about?" "They know who I am," she said, her voice trembling. "And they won't stop until they have me." Jonas stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Era wasn't just some slave girl. She was something far more valuable and far more dangerous. Tarek glanced at Jonas, his expression grim. "Well, Captain, it looks like your little bargain just got a whole lot more complicated." Jonas gritted his teeth, his hand tightening on the controls. "Complicated or not, they're not taking her." Era's eyes met his, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. For the first time, Jonas realized that protecting her might not just be the right thing to do. It might be his only choice. As the pirate ship loomed closer, Jonas's mind raced. He had dealt with plenty of dangerous situations in his time, but the stakes here felt different, higher. There was no telling what these pirates wanted, but the fear in Era's eyes told him everything he needed to know. "Strap in," Jonas barked, flipping switches on the control panel. Era hesitated for a moment, then slid into a nearby seat and fumbled with the harness. The Raven's Edge jolted as the pirate ship fired a warning shot, the blast narrowly missing their hull. Tarek's claws flew across the console. "Shields up. Engines are at full power, but if they're packing more firepower than us, we're toast." Jonas gritted his teeth. "We're not going down without a fight. Got a plan, Captain? Keep them busy while I figure one out." Tarek muttered something in his native tongue that sounded suspiciously like a curse, but he complied, steering the ship into an evasive maneuver. The pirate vessel responded immediately, firing another volley of plasma bolts that lit up the void. Jonas glanced at Era. She was clutching the armrests of her seat, her knuckles pale against her shimmering skin. "Era," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "if there's something you're not telling me, now's the time." She hesitated, her violet eyes darting between him and the chaos outside the viewport. I'm not who you think I am," she admitted finally. "I'm not a slave. I'm—" A deafening explosion cut her off as a bolt struck their rear shields, sending a shudder through the ship. Jonas cursed under his breath. Save it. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it later. The cockpit lights flickered as Tarek's voice broke through the alarms. They're hailing us, Jonas. Patch it through, Jonas said. A holographic image flickered to life in front of them, revealing a grizzled alien with scarred skin and a cybernetic eye. He grinned, his sharp teeth glinting. Captain Jonas, he drawled. Surrender the girl, and we might just let you live. Jonas crossed his arms, his expression defiant. You've got the wrong ship. There's no one here but me and my crew. The pirate chuckled darkly. Don't insult my intelligence. We know who she is and what she's worth. Hand her over, or we'll blow your little scrap heap to pieces. Jonas glanced at Era. Her face was pale, her eyes pleading silently. He turned back to the pirate. If you want her, you'll have to come and take her. The pirate's grin widened. Suit yourself. The transmission cut off, and the pirate ship unleashed another barrage of fire. Bold move, Tarek muttered, his claws tightening on the controls. Jonas ignored him. How's the engine looking? Not great. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they punch through the shields. Jonas nodded grimly. Then we'll have to make those 10 minutes count. Set a course for the nebula. If we can lose them in the radiation field, we might stand a chance. Tarek snorted. Might being the key word. It's the best we've got, Jonas snapped. The Raven's Edge surged forward, its engine straining as it raced toward the glowing expanse of the nebula. Behind them, the pirate ship gave chase, its weapons firing relentlessly. Era leaned forward in her seat, her voice trembling. Jonas, you don't understand. They won't stop. Not until they have me. Then tell me why, Jonas said without looking at her. What makes you so important? She hesitated, then took a deep breath. I'm not just anyone. I'm Princess Aralyn of the Lyraen Empire. Jonas froze. For a moment, he thought he must have misheard her. Princess? She nodded. My people sent me away to protect me. There was a coup. A faction tried to overthrow my family. They killed my parents, and I barely escaped. The Zarlan merchant found me drifting in an escape pod and, well, you know the rest. Jonas let out a low whistle. A princess. Of course. Why not? Tarek groaned. You're telling me we've been harboring royalty this whole time? No wonder the pirates are after us. Not just pirates, Era said softly. If they catch me, they'll turn me over to the faction. They'll use me to solidify their claim to the throne. Or kill me to eliminate the last heir. Jonas's jaw tightened. Well, they're not getting you. Not on my watch. As the Raven's Edge plunged into the nebula, the ship's sensors flickered and failed, the interference from the radiation scrambling their systems. Jonas gripped the controls, relying on instinct and experience to navigate the swirling clouds of gas and debris. The pirate ship hesitated at the edge of the nebula, its captain clearly weighing the risks. After a moment, it followed, its weapons firing blindly into the haze. Tarek worked furiously at his console. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they catch up. Jonas nodded. Era, you said you wanted to help. Now's your chance. Think you can handle the auxiliary systems? Era blinked, then nodded quickly. Yes. Tell me what to do. Jonas gave her a crash course on rerouting power to the engines and stabilizers. She caught on quickly, her slender fingers flying across the console with surprising skill. Not bad for a princess, Jonas muttered. Era shot him a faint smile. I wasn't always sitting on a throne, you know. The ship shuddered as another blast grazed their shields. Jonas, Tarek growled. We're out of time. Jonas glanced at Era, then made a decision. Hold on to something. He yanked the controls hard, sending the Raven's Edge into a spiraling dive. The pirate ship followed, its weapons firing wildly. Now! Jonas shouted. Era hit the switch, and the Raven's Edge released a cloud of ionized gas. The pirate ship flew straight into it, its systems short-circuiting instantly. Jonas let out a whoop as the pirate vessel spun out of control, disappearing into the swirling mists of the nebula. Tarek slumped back in his seat. I can't believe that worked. Era looked at Jonas, her violet eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. Jonas shrugged, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Don't mention it. Just another day on the Raven's Edge. But as they left the nebula behind, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would change all their lives forever. As the nebula's glowing tendrils faded into the backdrop of deep space, the Raven's Edge settled into a quieter rhythm. The alarms stopped, the ship's hum returned to a steady pulse, and the tension in the air began to dissolve. Jonas leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "Well, that was a hell of a ride," he said, glancing at Tarek, who was busy scanning for any signs of pursuit. "All clear," Tarek said, his tone gruff but relieved. "No sign of those pirates. For now." Jonas turned to Era, who was still seated at the auxiliary console. Her hands were trembling, though she tried to hide it by folding them neatly in her lap. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, her voice steady despite the lingering fear in her eyes. "I think so. Thank you for everything." Jonas rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how to respond. He wasn't the type to bask in gratitude. It didn't sit well with him. "Don't mention it. Just, maybe next time, give me a heads up if you're secretly royalty, yeah?" Era smiled faintly, a flicker of humor breaking through her solemn expression. "I'll try to remember that." Tarek stood, stretching his scaled limbs. "So, what's the plan, Captain? We can't just keep flying around with a princess on board. Someone's going to come looking for her sooner or later." Jonas frowned, leaning on the console as he considered their options. "We need to find someplace safe, somewhere out of the faction's reach. Any ideas, Era?" Era hesitated, her violet eyes thoughtful. "There's a colony in the Outer Rim, a neutral zone where my family used to have allies. If we can get there, they might be able to help us." "Neutral zones are tricky," Tark muttered. "Lot of folks with questionable morals hanging around those parts." "Sounds like my kind of place," Jonas said with a smirk. Era looked at him, a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. "You don't have to do this, you know. You've already done more than enough." Jonas shook his head. "I don't leave people to fend for themselves, especially not when the odds are this stacked. Besides, you're part of the crew now. And on this ship, we look out for each other." Her expression softened, and for the first time since they'd met, she looked almost hopeful. "All right," Jonas said, straightening up. "Let's set a course for this neutral zone and figure out the rest when we get there. Tarek, plot the route. Era, keep an eye on the systems. I'll see if we've got enough rations to make the trip." As the Raven's Edge glided through the quiet expanse of space, the crew settled into an uneasy calm. Jonas knew their journey was far from over. Era's presence would bring challenges, dangers, and more than a few headaches. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was flying towards something that mattered. In the cockpit, Era watched the stars streak past the viewport, a faint smile on her lips. For the first time since fleeing her home, she felt a flicker of hope. And for Jonas, Tarek, and the ragtag crew of the Raven's Edge, it was clear. Their greatest adventure had only just begun.